Group ACA reporting series. Today we will be talking about Part 2, the ACA applicable large employer report in Sage 100. Please note that Oasis is not in the business of advising our clients on tax matters. The presentation is not intended to advise you on your governmental reporting responsibilities. We're just merely trying to educate you on the features and the functionality in Sage 100 that will provide the ability for you to complete your 1094 and 1095 forms for reporting. We do advise that if you have specific tax or legal questions, that you seek the advice of your legal and tax providers for that. According to the Affordable Care Act, the reports 1094 and 1095 are required as part of the Employer Shared Responsibilities provision. It states that applicable large employers, known as ALs, are supposed to report information on their sponsored health care coverage if they have employed an average of 50 or more full-time or full-time equivalent employees in the preceding calendar year. Per IRS classification, a full-time employee is considered one who works 130 or more hours in a calendar month, and therefore part-time employees are considered those that work less than 130 hours in a calendar month. The full-time equivalent is a calculation, and it's based on the number of hours worked by the part-time employees for the calendar month. And we'll talk about that calculation in depth in a few moments. So in Sage 100, they have provided the large employer report. And this report can be used to help you determine whether or not you are considered a large employer or an AL. And remember, you have to have an average of 50 or more full-time and full-time equivalent employees for the year. It is based on the perpetual history tables PR_22 and PR_23. So as designated in our first part of our series, you did need to have perpetual history turned on before the first payroll processing of the year. And if it was not, the calculations on this report are not going to be accurate, and you may need to do some manual calculations for those pay periods during which you did not have perpetual history turned on. This report will report the hours of service worked in a calendar month. Please note that Sage 100 payroll processing is based on pay periods. So if you have a weekly or bi-weekly type payroll, you know that it is often the case that a pay period may span the 2 calendar months. So when that happens, Sage has done a calculation that would prorate the hours worked for the pay period and designate per the number of work days in each calendar month. The full-time equivalent count is a calculation, and the calculation is the total of hours of service for the calendar month accumulated by the part-time employees. Remember, that is part-time employees are considered those that have less than 130 hours. But note that the IRS has capped the calculation at 120 hours per person. So if you have an employee that has worked more than 120 hours, but of course less than 130, their hours for the calculation would be capped at 120. That total is then divided by 120 hours. The result calculated is then rounded to the second decimal place and then rounded to the nearest whole number. So as an example, I've got my 4 part-time workers listed here. Notice that in the hours worked column that none of them worked 130 or more hours, so we are just looking at part-time employees. But notice For the calculation for the full-time equivalent, notice that Susan Anthony is capped at 120 hours, even though she did actually work 125 hours. So the total for those workers for the month was 345 hours. Once divided by the 120 hours and calculated to the second decimal, that's 2.88. And then, of course, rounded up to the nearest whole number would then leave you with a full-time equivalent of 3 employees. To actually run the large employer report, please keep in mind that you have to be at the supported product update level to have this feature in your Sage 100. But you would navigate to your payroll, then to the ACA folder, and then to the ACA applicable large employer report. Also, please remember that this is a new feature and is allowed or disallowed in security role maintenance. So if you need to run this report, you do need to allow the security for that in your role maintenance. And we discussed this in the first part of our series. So once presented with the applicable large employer report printing screen, there are several printing options that you have here. The first one is a button for earnings to exclude. This is not something that will be typical for most of you guys, but one example may be a pay advance, because pay advance is not for hours worked, so that would be something that you would want to exclude from the hours worked calculation here. But typically, most of you guys will not have earnings to exclude. There's also a checkbox for print seasonal employees. The employees that you have marked as seasonal in your employee maintenance, if you want to include them in the report, it will print them in a separate section of the report, but their information will not be included in your report totals. There is also a checkbox for print totals only, and this will just generate the totals page without the employee details. If you do not check that box, you will get, your printout will include the employee details and the totals page. Date range. You can also choose which date range to print your report. Please note the verbiage on the print screen does say period end date. So if you are one of those that where your pay periods can span multiple months, note that in order to pick up all the hours for, let's say, February, and your pay period did not end until March the 3rd, in order to pick up those hours for February, you would need to include your March pay period ending date to pull those totals in. Because of the way the prorating works and because of the spanning of the months, Sage does recommend that you run the report with the full 12 months to make sure that you are getting the most accurate hours worked on your employee details. So when you run the large employer report, the report will look like this. Notice that I have selected on this report in the upper left corner, I have selected to run it for the full year. So I'm getting 12 months worth here, and 12 months is the maximum amount of time that you can run a particular large employer report. That's the maximum time period. So on my report, it does list every employee that is not a seasonal employee. And so again, if you do select seasonal employee printing, they will print in a separate section. But notice the employees are listed in employee number only. You do not get an option for sorting the information. So in my example here, I do have, when I was creating my demo data, I did want to make sure I had some full-time and some part-time employees. So when I was entering my data, my full-time employees do appear at the top and my part-time employees do appear at the bottom. But in your case, with your employee numbers, your report will not be quite like that. And I just wanted to point out that there is no sorting for that. But in my example, that was just the way I had entered my data. So on here we see the January and the February hours. In my demo data, I did create pay periods so that they did span multiple months. So in March, you see a few hours listed there, and that is because my pay period did span the 2 months, and it did do the prorating of those hours, and you can see that there. So the totals page, which if you get the detail report, you do still get the totals page. But if you print the totals only, your page will look like this. And so on the totals page, you have, it will just give you the total counts. And the top line will give you your full-time employee count. So if we look at the detail above, notice in January I have 3 full-time employees. So if I look at the January information in the detail, I see only 3 employees that have 130 or more hours for that month. So that's where the 3 is coming from. Then the full-time equivalent count is 2. So then I take the remaining employees that are part-time, so those that are less than 130 hours, and do the calculation on the hours that they have. It has then rounded to 2 for the full-time equivalent employee count. So in total, I had 5 employees that were full-time or full-time equivalent. Notice in February, one of our part-time employees from January worked more hours and then became a full-time employee for the month of February. And so we see in February that the number of employees that worked full-time, 130 or more hours, became 4. And then the remaining 2 employees were then calculated and rounded to a full-time equivalent of 2. So for the month of February, I actually had 6 employees for the total on the full-time plus full-time equivalent count. In March, because I only had part of one payroll, it went ahead and did the calculation. So because I only had a few hours and it was not the full month's worth of payroll data, it did the calculation and indicated that I had 1 full-time equivalent employee in the count. So notice that I've got just the January and February in full numbers, and then I've got the part of the March numbers there in my calculation. So the next line of the report shows the average count for the full-time plus full-time employees. And this count will take the number of periods that you have selected to report. So in my case, I've selected to report 12 periods. It will take the full-time plus full-time employee equivalent count, which is the line right above the average line. It will take the totals for each one of those columns and divide by the number of periods that you have designated to show up on your report. Because I've designated to pull in 12 months, it takes all of these numbers and divides by 12. So it does include the zeros in that count, which is why my average count looks so low. That would be, once I had a full year's worth of payroll data in here, that would become more accurate. And then the bottom line there is the total employee count that you have. So that is the number of employees that you've paid. When we close out the report, we will get prompted regarding the full-time employee count, which is the top row of information, and the total employee count, which is the bottom row. It will prompt us if we want to update the full-time and total employee counts in your ACA employer file, and you can answer that accordingly. You can say yes every single time, and every time you say yes, it will simply update that table for you. We'll talk a little bit more about the employer file in our next session, but at this moment, I just wanted to advise you on the prompting that you will have, and if you say yes, it will then import those counts into your employer file. So remaining in our ACA series, the next part will be the ACA employer maintenance, where those counts will be updated if you say yes on the previous question. And then part four will be the ACA employee maintenance, and that is where you enter the information for the offer of coverage and the amounts paid by your employee. And then part 5 will be printing forms 1094 and 1095. Additional IRS resources. There are many resources on the IRS website, and the links are listed here. There is the Affordable Care Act provisions if you need to seek more information about that. There's also the Information Center for applicable large employers. And then there is a recent article from the IRS regarding the 8 things applicable large employers should know about reporting and offers of coverage. Thank you for joining us today. For additional questions or to schedule updates for installation or additional assistance, please contact our office. The Oasis support phone line is 502-429-6902, extension 227, or you can email us at techsupport@oasisky.com. Thank you.